My name is Alex Nichols, the University Lecturer in Social Entrepreneurship here at the Skoll Centre at Oxford. And I'd like to welcome you very much to the third day of the Skoll World Forum and our research plenary session here looking at the future of philanthropy. Those of you who were here last year will know that we had really an entire forum looking at issues around finance and resources. And a lot of issues around philanthropy and the future of philanthropy came through during that meeting. But I think things continue to move fast, and it's a useful point now to check back in on the opportunities and challenges of this particular source of resource for social entrepreneurs and civil society organizations. Jeff Skoll has already mentioned some of the new jargonism around this stuff that you'll pick up in The Economist and elsewhere. Philanthrocapitalists, venture capitalists, venture philanthropists even, and a whole new lexicon is coming around philanthropy. But some of the fundamental challenges of the relationship between giver and receiver, between foundation and grantee, are as old as there has been those kind of relationships and continue to be challenging, I think, for both the philanthropist and the investee. So really, this morning, we have an esteemed panel who I think are going to look at a number of dimensions around the relationship between philanthropy and civil society, the opportunities and challenges for foundations going forward, trying to understand how that relationship may be changing, how grants can be used perhaps in different and more creative ways, what strategies there are for using foundation corpus capital investment as well as grant investment. And perhaps something about how more engaged philanthropy can pay dividends, but also has challenges. So on the panel this morning, we have Professor Helmut Anheier, Professor of Public Policy and Social Welfare, and the Director of the Center for Civil Society at UCLA's School of Public Affairs. Helmut, in fact, in common with all members of the panel, has been one of the main scholarly researchers to really establish the voluntary sector and civil society as an area of scholarly and academic pursuit through rigorous and relentless research and creative and innovative thinking. During his time at the London School of Economics, he created the Centre for Civil Society there and was its director for a period. And those of you who know the LSE will know how influential that centre continues to be. He's also worked at Johns Hopkins with Lester Salomon, next to him there, in helping to establish an important body of work looking at the more quantitative and statistical side of the non-profit sector. He's widely published. He's a founding editor of the Journal of Civil Society and Voluntas that many of you will know. And more recently, he's written with Diana Leet a book on creative philanthropy that some of you may be already familiar with. And if not, I strongly advise you to become so. Our second speaker will be Mark Kramer, who is carrying a very bad head cold. So I'm even more grateful than usual for Mark's contribution today. He oversees the Foundation Strategy Group's consulting practice and its action initiative. He has extensive experience in consultancy, having created and run his own firm for more than a decade. He's also a qualified researcher and scholar, having, I think, at least 3 degrees, probably, maybe more, and is an expert in CSR philanthropy and has published in the Harvard Business Review on at least 3 occasions with his colleague at the Foundation Strategy Group, Michael Porter. He's also a senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And finally, Professor Lester Salomon, who's at Johns Hopkins University and is the director of their Center for Civil Society there. Lester has an extraordinary career spanning engagement with government and also a range of academic institutions, although I've only found out today that you were working in Mississippi during the civil rights movement, so that must have been very engaging and challenging, I think, and I guess formative in some ways. Lester, with Helmut and others, really did pioneer, as I just mentioned earlier, the notion that the voluntary sector and civil society could be looked at critically and with the tools and lenses of the social sciences in a way that really hadn't been conceived of before. and through some extraordinary ambitious projects has built a body of work that really puts together the global perspective of civil society, underpinned with hard and reliable facts and resilient methodology, which has done an enormous amount to, I think, give the subject credibility to our academic peers. He's very widely published and continues to produce influential and challenging books. So it's an extraordinary panel, and I thank them all for coming. The format will be, well, I'll ask each of them to speak for sort of 20 minutes, maybe a little less, a little more, but not much more. We'll have a time for clarification or specific questions at the end of each presentation, and then I hope a good 20 minutes to half an hour for general discussion at the end. So in terms of questioning, please keep them specific to the presentations in the time afterwards, and keep more general questions for the end. So it's my great pleasure to introduce first Helmut Anheier.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to present a summary of a project that I finished with Diana Lead about 6 months to a year ago on creative philanthropy. And it is an attempt to develop a new model for philanthropic engagement. I will first put the argument we make in a context, then present the argument, show you a number of case studies, and then outline some of the implications our work has. It is probably true to say that there is a renaissance of foundations. There is new interest in this very old organizational form, going back to antiquity and having gone through a number of significant changes within the last 100 years. And we see this renaissance in countries that are very, very different in many respects. And on the slide you see the United States, the UK, Australia, Japan, and others. And we also have the event of the 21st century mega foundation that is probably similar in scale to the introduction of the very large US foundations in the beginning of the 20th century. And just having one or two of these large foundations catch the public eye, and certainly the interest of the media, propels public attention to foundations. With these heightened expectations, it is, I think, important to explore what the real potential of foundations and other philanthropic institutions might be. And I'm sure, as most of you know, particularly those who work in foundations and study foundations, they are not well understood. They're not well understood by the general public, and what is sometimes even more problematic, they're not well understood by politicians. We do have an awareness gap about what foundations are and what they can do. And the growth of foundations, as significant as it is, we should probably recall that most of the foundations that exist in the average OECD country were established within the last 25 years. That growth is nonetheless a relative one. The non-profit sector as a whole, and certainly the wealth held by private individuals and the capacity of the state to accumulate endowment and wealth has increased even more. So please do keep in mind that foundations are not really moving ahead of the curve or in front of the curve of accumulation, but they're somewhat behind, but nonetheless they are growing. Next to this renaissance that you see, and this greater interest, is also what one could describe as a low-key malaise. And it doesn't apply to all countries, but I certainly see it in the United States, where there's a disquiet about payout rates. There's increased scrutiny of what foundations can and should do, what they cannot do. And there are hearings about foundations and so on. Some of that is obviously quite political, but it has to do, I think, with the awareness gap that exists in the world of politics, but it also has to do with a certain searching within the foundation world of what the future might hold. In the European Union, The debate is no longer really about how much space there should be for foundations relative to the national states, the member states, and relative to what the Commission wants to do. I think that is being negotiated, but it is really a debate about what could foundations achieve relative to what is being achieved. And there is a sense that foundations are not fulfilling their full potential. So to sum it up, I think there is a need for a new message, a new model perhaps, and we should, I think, usefully look back in time and realize that the last significant innovation in the field of philanthropy, and that might be a surprise to some of us, happened about 100 years ago, when, with the rise of the modern US foundation, we moved from what was called charity then to philanthropy, and the writings of Carnegie and Rockefeller are full of that, when we said charity is to fill in gaps in government provision, and philanthropy is really about a more scientific approach to social problem solving, attacking root causes rather than alleviating the symptoms. That was very much influenced by a profound belief in the scientific method. There's something very methodical about how these new foundations went about their business, and it is no surprise that much of their grant giving was in the field of education and research. And in the latter part of the 20th century, when we saw a rising critique of what was then seen as conventional philanthropy, we had an emphasis on strategic philanthropy, and which I think some of you have come across. It was, I think, highly process-oriented. It emphasized evaluation, it emphasized all sorts of impact measurement, and it largely was an extension of the business world and the way of doing business into the world of philanthropy. And terms like venture philanthropy and the like became quite fashionable at that time. But it did not really change the overall purpose or the model of philanthropy. It just made it more efficient, if you will, perhaps, but it certainly made it more business-like and less academic in its approach. And what we argue in this book is that we may have to think about a new model, one that we call creative philanthropy. And by this we mean the unique capacity of foundations to spot solutions to problems that no other actor or institution is picking up, and to jumpstart and then help sustain an innovation and help disseminate and implement it. Behind this capacity to be a creative agent is this unique position of the endowed foundation. It is all about independence. And sometimes we see independence of philanthropy as a problem in terms of governance and accountability. But you can turn it around and say that this is indeed the unique signature, the signature characteristic of philanthropy, that it is independent of market consideration in terms of having no shareholder and no principals looking over its shoulders. And it's also independent of an electorate and also of what you might say dominant elite preferences. A foundation can be created by somebody who is outside, somebody who is on the fringe of current thinking. Foundations are indeed the most independent institutions of modern societies. And Waldemar Nielsen, the historian of American foundations, once called them the quasi-aristocratic institutions in a formerly egalitarian society. And this is, in fact, a very, very profound statement. The foundations have an independence, and of course the people creating foundations establish independence, or an independent institution that otherwise is very hard to find to that extent in modern society. So we were interested in researching creative philanthropy. We wanted to get a better understanding of what innovation and creativity mean in the context of philanthropy. To do that, we looked at hundreds of foundations and foundation programs. And we were looking for instances where the independence of a foundation allowed it to become highly innovative in a particular field, where we could say that only a foundation could have done that, where there were institutional blockages or there was neglect by other actors, be it non-profit institutions, be it government, be it the market. And a foundation stepped in, saw the problem, and helped develop a solution. That's what we were looking for. And we were not looking for a quantitative answer. We would not wanted to say in the end, perhaps it would be useful to do so, that of all what foundations spend a year, X% is allocated to this kind of problem solving. No, we were trying to understand what are the drivers, what are the characteristics of creative philanthropy. We developed vignettes when looking at hundreds of foundation activities, 2-3 page summaries of what had happened, and then said, after looking at these vignettes, here are 6 or 7 or 8 case studies that we think offer us a good insight into what makes for creative philanthropy. And I just walk you through some of these case studies, and they are very rich case studies, and in the few minutes I have, I cannot summarize them and do justice to them, to their richness, but take them as little teaser statements for you to look into more detail. But we tried to look at large foundations, at small foundations. We looked at foundations in the UK, we looked at foundations in the US and in Australia. Unfortunately, we did not look at foundations in other parts of the world for this book, but I think we get enough of a range for making the argument we would like to support. The Carnegie UK Trust is a fairly small operation, but it's quite old. It was established over 100 years ago in Dunfermline in Scotland, but it has a tiny budget of £1.4 million. And with that funding, it has really transformed a number of policy issues in the UK, for example, around aging. The Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust was a key player in the passage of the Freedom of Information Act and has been behind the scenes when it comes to the peace talks in Northern Ireland. And also the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is not a very, very large institution when it comes to endowment. What is interesting in the Rowntree case is that they supported activities around the Freedom of Information Act, and obviously you probably know the Northern Ireland case, for 10, 15, 20 years. So there is an endurance in the way the foundation engages. In Australia, the Victoria Women's Trust had also a long-term engagement in building a coalition against family violence and community problems, and is now investing in water preservation. In the United States, the Rosenberg Foundation in San Francisco looked at child support systems in California and is now investing in gender inequity in large corporations such as Walmart and preparing, I think, a class action suit. All of that takes time, and all of that takes, as I'm sure you can see, a lot of courage for a foundation to engage itself in. The Casey Foundation and the program Kids Counts. The Wallace Foundation reframed the debate. We look at a shortage of principals in public schools. The Pew Charitable Trust in the field of environment, and the John and James Knight Foundation in the field of journalism and the intersection of media, politics, and society. These were examples of what we regarded as highly creative philanthropy. We also looked at the conservative foundations. The conservative foundations for our non-American guests here this morning are a group of politically conservative foundations that over the last 20 years have pushed a conservative political agenda in the United States and prepared what is known as the Reagan Revolution and the what you might say the Washington Consensus, which is now under renewed scrutiny. And we also looked at the awardees for creative philanthropy of the Robert W. Scrivener Award, in a sense to get, in an attempt to get a better sense of what makes for creativity. And what we found is, at some level, quite surprising. At another level, we found also what we expected. First, in terms of innovation, we found in the world of philanthropy something that has been identified in the world of business innovations as well, and I make reference here to the work by Rosebeth Kanter on innovation and her book, The Change Masters. And we also found that, like in the business world, making decisions in the world of philanthropy involves a high degree of uncertainty. That's when innovation comes about. It also involved good understanding. It involved a knowledge intensity. So you have to be uncertain about the outcome, but you have to be knowledgeable about how you approach it. It also typically was controversial. And many of the grants that we looked at, certainly in the case of the Rosenberg Foundation, in the case of the Roundtree Foundation in Carnegie, there was political controversy about it. And there was also sometimes controversy within the foundation, whether this is the right program or the right activity. Next to controversy, we typically found that the activity of the foundation reaches across boundaries. It was not something that stayed, let's say, within the nonprofit sector alone, or that stayed within one field or one area, but that cut across and connected politics to nonprofits and to businesses and to the world of philanthropy. And with that idea of innovation in mind, we looked at the characteristics of creative philanthropy. And in the book, we go to great lengths of spelling out what the management implications of this are, and so I'll try to cut it short a bit. But the first characteristic is somewhat surprising. It really wasn't all about money. That a foundation has resources is important, but it does not give you a seat at a table where it ultimately matters. Right? You have to bring in knowledge. You have to be seen as a trusted intermediary. You have to be seen as a resource, and not only as a general resource, and not only as somebody who writes a check. So grant making is only one tool among others. These foundations were typically knowledge-driven, and I think it's a fact that we very often do not appreciate, that foundations are great repositories of information that sometimes is turned into knowledge. But foundations are typically at the crossroads of many things. Think about the applications that come to a foundation, think about a program that a foundation engages in. And that knowledge, that information accumulates. And using that in grant making was an advantage. Like few other institutions in society, a foundation can be in it for the long term. We sometimes called it, foundations can run a marathon and not a relay race. Right? Whereas in the world of politics, we're typically bound to the electoral cycle. In the business world, we're bound to the expectations, increasingly short-term, of shareholders and investment firms. In the world of philanthropy, we're freed of that, and that allows for medium to long-term engagements. And some of the very successful foundation interventions we looked at went on for 5, 10, 15 years. In some cases, the foundation held back with grant making in a significant way to wait for the right opportunity. For example, in the case of the Roundtree Foundation, they waited for the right opportunity in Northern Ireland for a long time, and when it was there, they could step in. But they invested for years in preparing the ground. And the same when it came to other opportunities opening up in the world of politics. The foundations can take risks. like no other institution in society, but they can absorb risk, which is probably much more important, and provide leadership. And these characteristics that you see here came together in a significant way in all of the cases we looked at. And it also is worth pointing out that there was a significant part of show and tell, that the foundation, sometimes remaining in the background, but certainly wanted to make a public statement and wanted to influence public awareness about its activity. So a show and tell and an active dissemination is a critical part of philanthropic success. So what are some of the generalizations, or what kind of a model do we have in mind when we talk about creative philanthropy? What could be the future role of foundations, and when are foundations needed most? Now, this is a generalization, of course, and that suggests themselves based on the case studies we have done for the book and we have done since then. But the first of these four conditions that I would like to share with you in the concluding part of my presentation. The first condition is about a need, or the idea that foundations are entrepreneurs. And I think it's probably very fitting to say that at a conference like this about social entrepreneurship, that there is something you might call philanthropic entrepreneurship, and it implies that a need is identified that for whatever reason is beyond the reach or the interest of other actors, and where foundations can provide the leverage of and the resources commensurate with the problem at hand. Right? Spotting that need and helping carry that a solution, finding a solution and carry it through a process to implementation, to finding a sustainable outcome. That is a very entrepreneurial activity. So that's the first condition. There has to be a need, and the foundation has to be right for it. If government can do it, foundations I don't think should touch it. If non-profits could do it, let non-profits do it. If the market can do it, let the market do it. But finding that need that is outside the interest of other actors, right? That's the entrepreneurial part that makes foundations such creative institutions. But mostly, we also find that foundations cannot do it alone. The needs that we have tend to be at a scale that even the richest foundations probably cannot do it without involving others. Typically, foundations have to establish some form of a coalition of individuals and organizations. And I should emphasize that many of the successful cases we studied involved individuals, where it wasn't an organization as such, but in that organization or behind that organization was somebody willing to work on this for 5, 10, or 15 years. And it typically was a relatively small number of individuals. And these individuals were networked amongst each other and had the foundation as backup. And these individuals and organizations are activated to develop the program and to implement it. And as I said before, these individuals were typically not only in one sector, but they came from across different walks of life, and they were in different institutional surroundings, and increasingly also in different regions of the world. So next to foundations as entrepreneurs, there is the idea that foundations are institution builders. There has been much reflection on the role of foundations in relation to risk. Foundations see themselves as risk takers, but this is not quite right, because unlike financial institutions or entrepreneurs in the business world, a foundation is not taking the same kind of risk. What it actually does, it can absorb the risks others take. And we like to think about foundations as risk absorbers for those who implement and work on programs. We found that in the successful cases of foundation programs, there was not so much an emphasis on performance criteria and performance indicators that involved that required the grantee to fill in long forms and write a long narrative. But there was much more of an ongoing dialogue with the grantee or with others involved in the program. But it was an ongoing dialogue, it was an exchange, it was something that encouraged learning, and it had less of an element of control, and it was less about finance, it was much more about outcomes, and it was less about input and output. So foundations as risk absorbers, as an institution that can set a benchmark, that can set goals, but be strategic and flexible in how you get there and with what means. And finally, we see foundations as mediators. There is an emphasis on collection and analysis of data, of sharing information across the different project sites, and foundations can very often appear as being the neutral partner in a project, or as we refer to them, as the honest broker, and they can mediate across parties that would normally probably not, perhaps even talk to each other, as in the case of the Roundtree Foundation in Northern Ireland, or that would not be aware of their shared interests and their mutual interests. Foundations as mediators. So our argument is that the foundation of the future will be the more relevant, the more they act as social entrepreneurs, as institution builders, as risk absorbers, and as mediators. And in conclusion, we suggest that foundations are neither poor imitations of government, nor the chosen tools for quick fixes. Right? They're not the chosen tools for quick fixes because most of the problems that lend themselves to a philanthropic interest are so complex and solutions are long-term that we cannot really say that we solve something with 4 or 5 or 6 grants and in a relatively short period of time, but it requires a knowledgeable engagement over a longer period. I think foundations are something far more important than that. They could, and some of them are, but more of them could become potential powerhouses of creative thinking and the kind of creating working that our society needs. We do not have a shortage or a scarcity of resources necessarily in modern society. What we have is a weakness in not only creating innovation, but perhaps even more in seeing an innovation through a process that leads to sustainable solutions. And that's where foundations are needed most, and the approach that we propose here and in the book, Creative Philanthropy, could become part of a step towards that promise. So creative philanthropy as a new model for foundations in the 21st century. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helmut. Do we have any specific questions about Helmut's presentation? Gentleman in the back there. Yes, sorry. On the left, yes.
Good morning, thank you. Helmut, yes, I appreciate the presentation very much and a thoughtful analysis of philanthropy. I'd like to pick you up on one comment you made towards the end, and you used the term powerhouse as a potential description of a foundation. And this, in the spirit of academic challenge, take this comment, please. The term powerhouse starts to make me a little bit nervous because it seems to assume that the values of that foundation are we assume they're ethically good in a sort of agreed form. But how do we know that's the case? And if you have, for example, one man and billions of dollars deciding to become a power builder, powerhouse, how do you know that that's going to invoke good in this world? And is there not a danger behind that to become inherently undemocratic and potentially damaging?
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, we don't know whether that's inherently good or bad. What we do know, however, is that we feel more comfortable in having these independent centers of power in society than we did 50 or 40 years ago. And of course, having the Gates Foundation, for example, spend more money on AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa than the World Health Organization does, it brings with it governance issues. And I'm fully aware of that. We have a lot of checks and balances in the WHO, but we may not have that when it comes to the Gates Foundation and the way they make decisions. If we move, let's assume we have a world in which we have many more of the Gates Foundations, the very large foundations. But keep in mind that they are really the exception. Most foundations are much, much smaller. And we would have to revisit some of the broader governance issues around it. But certainly in the US and certainly in a large number of European countries, I think we're more at ease with having independent centers of power and having a certain plurality in the way we approach issues. So there is less of a government monopoly when it comes to addressing public issues, such as HIV/AIDS and the like. But I do not know whether it's really good or bad. What it does, it creates diversity in the way we approach public problems.
Thank you. I think we have. Do we have one over here first? No, we didn't. So, the gentleman at the back. Yeah. Could you say who you are, please?
Yeah, Andrew Jack from the Financial Times. A couple of points. First of all, striking, all your case studies are from the Anglo-Saxon world. Any thoughts actually about the differences with non-English speaking cultures and languages in terms of foundations? And secondly, just to put this all in context, you've highlighted some very interesting, innovative, creative, sort of against the grain foundations, but actually put it in the context of, total philanthropic activity and how much is actually for rather more conventional established causes and rather less creative, if you could.
Yeah. Let me take the second part first. We did not measure this, but I would first of all say that we're not arguing let's all become creative and let's forget about the charitable activities of foundations or let's no longer support those activities that would be more conventional philanthropy. Here too we say diversity is probably the best approach, but most of what philanthropy does is probably somewhere between charity and philanthropy. And a relatively small portion would be in the field of creativity that we describe here. But I can't put numbers on it. It's just the impression we had by looking at hundreds of foundation annual reports and activities. You're absolutely right. We limited ourselves to 3 countries, the UK, the US, and Australia. That was not a choice of ours. It just happened to be also the interest of our funders and where we lived at the time. If we were to go to other parts of the world, I think we would find also very, very good examples of creative philanthropy. I'm convinced of that. I'm not going to mention any names, but we're looking at the moment at community foundations as a particular segment of the philanthropic world, and we found actually a lot of innovative ideas outside the world of the more established community foundation, let's say in the US. There's a lot of innovation going on in Europe around community foundations and definitely in the developing world.
Perhaps one more question? Yes.
Thank you. Marcello Palazzi, Progresso Foundation in the Netherlands. Fascinating. One question and some sort of issue here between the role of individuals which you pointed out, and the institution building. In a way, you could say that institutions have been one of the challenges of the last 10, 15 years, you know, the UN and global governance, and also our governments, our political institutions. And it seems to me that a lot of what has been very exciting about creative philanthropy has been outside institutions, been initiatives, campaigns, programs that have a fairly short-term existence. They're not there to create an institution. So I wonder what you found in your study, because I see a sort of dilemma in there. Is it about breaking away from the institutions, creating a new set of model for the future, or building institutions that, in a way, create their own dynamics, and we get stuck again in the problems of institutions? So,
yeah, it's interesting. You've given your answer already. It's really both. You need individuals with some institutional embeddedness to create new institutions, and then these new institutions have developed their inertia over time, and then you need to step out again. A good example, which had nothing to do with the world of foundations, but it is so much on my mind because I didn't know about it, and I just read about it last week, was the way what we now know as the European Union came about. You had governments behind it, but it was really 5 people who met over a period of, I think, 18 months. In private homes, in the countryside someplace, and worked out a platform that then became later on, much later, the European Union. And now we think of the Commission as this huge bureaucratic Moloch sitting somewhere in Brussels and reaching into its tentacles out and over. So if you want to change the European Union now, you probably would, I would say, put your money on people rather than institutions, but it was indeed initially people who created the institution behind it. We have very successful examples in this country. As you know, the Voluntary Foundation, or the Voluntary family of foundations, had a program to develop a think tank culture in the UK. And that think tank culture did not come about by them saying, oh, we're building demos or IPPR. No, they identified people who then could build these think tanks. Right? And also, I think the way the conservative foundations became so influential in the United States is not only by identifying institutions and organizations and grantees, but by betting on individuals and staying with these individuals for quite some time. But the argument we make is that it cannot be the individual alone, but you need to have the right individual in the right institutional context or at a cross-section of things, and then you can move things forward. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to hold it there, so please hold your questions for later, and now turn to our second speaker, to Mark Kramer. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I have to say, first, I apologize for my cold. Hopefully, we'll make it through together. But second, I have to say, I really love this conference and this audience because, in my experience, it brings together many of the most forward-thinking philanthropists in the world. And so I want to use this occasion to test a pretty bold hypothesis. This is not something I've written up yet. And I would welcome your reactions as to whether it's just my head cold speaking or whether there's something here. But I want to suggest that we are on the cusp of a generational divide, that the students who are graduating today and the social entrepreneurs today are struggling with a transition, and that struggle is really a symptom of change, and that the following generation will not see a separate nonprofit sector and a separate for-profit sector. That the division that we grew up thinking about, that on the one hand there's the business and for-profit and you make money and you don't really care about social issues to the extent you can get away with it, and on the other hand there's the nonprofit sector and civil society whose job it is to solve social problems, that division is very hard for us to let go of, but that we are going through a transition to a generation that will not see it that way. And I would suggest, while I absolutely agree with Helmut's analysis of where foundations are and what they can do today, I would suggest in the future people will not see philanthropy as the primary means of solving social problems. So let me explain from several different points of view why I think that this trend is happening. And first, let me be clear. I'm not saying philanthropy will disappear. Harvard University is too good at fundraising for that to happen. But in all seriousness, there are many rewards that come from the status, the prestige, the association with many major institutions that are phenomenally effective at fundraising. Harvard does spend about $60 million a year on its fundraising alone. But I think you would probably agree with me that adding to Harvard or the Metropolitan Museum of Art's endowment is not a major step towards solving social problems. So I think that there are really 5 different strands that lead me to this conclusion. The first one is pretty clearly that the current system is not working. The second is shifts in behavior that we see happening both in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. The third is a real momentum and emergence of social investment. The fourth is a flood of young talent, sometimes people who have made a lot of money early on, sometimes not, that is desiring to come in and work on social issues. And last, I want to touch on some research we did for the Gates Foundation as to what makes high net worth donors highly effective. So let me just run through those 5 strands quickly. First, the bad news about it not working. I don't want to be US-centric, but it is the region where I know the data best, and I think it is probably not atypical from other countries in the world. But we have a phenomenal nonprofit sector in America. It's almost $1 trillion a year. It's about 7% of the workforce. It has grown at a very healthy rate over the last 50 years. And every problem you would care to look at, whether it's environmental, educational, social welfare, is the same or worse over this period of phenomenal growth in the nonprofit sector. I also think we're confronting this generational shift because social issues and environmental issues are all long-term issues. And you can coast for many decades without feeling the effects. But I think that our generation and the next 2 generations are the ones who will not have the luxury of avoiding the effects of our past choices. It's not working in terms of the philanthropic sector. It's also not working in terms of the corporate sector. You look at the auto industry in the US or the healthcare industry in the US, both of which are self-destructing because they found it easier to spend money lobbying to prevent legislation that would bring them into line with concerns of much of the population and much of the world. And as a result, are paying the price. 69% of Americans would like to see universal health care coverage. It is not happening because of the pharmaceutical industry's lobby. But they are paying a price for that as they're finding their economic model falling apart. It's also not happening in terms of government. The United States spends more on public education than the GDP of all but 16 countries in the world. And our students consistently rank toward the bottom of the list of developed countries. So I suggest that the problems are becoming inescapable, and the way we've been doing it isn't working. And that social entrepreneurship is an interim step in many ways that has emerged as we are trying to grapple with how to put these 2 things together, how to find more effective ways of addressing social problems. The second strand of thinking is the shifts in behavior that we see by both sectors. Michael Porter and I just did an article in the December Harvard Business Review where we asserted that the social value proposition of a business is the key competitive advantage going forward. That businesses need to consider social issues not just to be good neighbors or good citizens, not just in response to activists, but because that is the only way they will succeed. And we see this happening with companies of all sizes. We see GE announcing that green technology is the growth industries that they're going to focus on. Microsoft will soon announce an initiative to focus on the 5 billion people that can't afford computers and to find ways to give people computers for free and a kind of time-sharing arrangement for the software. We find that companies are looking seriously at the bottom of the pyramid. And we also have found that companies can be tremendously powerful agents for social change. One of my favorite examples is the Equator Principles, where 9 major global banks got together and set standards, social and safety and environmental standards for major construction projects like dams and pipelines around the world. It took about a year for them to negotiate the standards, but as soon as they put them in place, 75% of all major project financing in the world was under those standards. And it became impossible to build something without meeting those standards. I challenge you to think of how a nonprofit organization could, in 1 year, have changed the safety and environmental standards for construction projects around the world. We also see a shift in the behavior in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. We've just completed a study on new approaches to evaluation among foundations, and we find that they're taking a much more instrumental approach. They are defining clear goals, and they are looking at their progress toward the goal. They're actually holding themselves accountable for the change happening in the world, looking less at what was the outcome of a particular grant and looking at whether the needle is moving on the issue that they're taking responsibility for addressing. I mentioned, and the other point, of course, is an increasing number of partnerships between the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, as well as government. Public-private partnerships. The panel yesterday talked about using corporations, working with corporations to leverage change. And indeed, corporations bring capabilities to solving social problems that, frankly, you can't imagine solving them without engaging companies. Issues like healthcare involve corporations. Issues like economic development involve corporations. We can't think of these as social problems that can be addressed without business. The third strand is social investment. We've just completed a study, and there should be the executive summary in your packs for this conference that Sarah Couch from FSG led, looking at trends in what we called mission investing by foundations. And here we mean the term investment in the traditional sense of investing in something that is going to give you your money back and hopefully a financial return on top of it. And what we found is that the rate at which the number of foundations that are doing social investment in recent years, mission investing, has doubled. The amount of new money going into mission investments has tripled. We found that the fastest growth is not among the large foundations, but is among foundations with under $200 million in assets. To give you a sense of the momentum here, over the 32 years up to 2000, mission investments grew at about 3% a year. In the 5 years since, to 2005, they've grown at 16% a year. We also found some interesting statistics that these investments are not as risky as people might have thought. 75% of the foundations making these investments had a 0 default rate. Of those that kept adequate records so that we could tell whether the payments were received and received on time, and unfortunately that is a minority. But of those, 90% received an IRR that was equal to or higher than the expected return they had when they went into the investment. And people are beginning to accept the idea of a blended return, the idea of trading off some financial return for social benefit. Ashoka, Arthur Wood here, and David Green and Deutsche Bank are putting together a $20 million social investment fund that will invest in eye care in India. We are actually working with UBS and a large foundation to put together what will be a $75 to $100 million fund that will invest in healthcare businesses in Africa, in the belief, again, that you can't create an infrastructure without private enterprise. The cost of capital in Africa now is 30%. given the risk. We think, and UBS thinks, that they have a considerable number of high net worth individuals, philanthropically inclined, who would be happy to get a 6 or 8% return and accept as the difference the social benefit that they're achieving in Africa. And again, we see more examples of people accepting this trade-off. Fourth, I talked about the flood of talent coming in, and certainly there are many people who have, in the last decade or so, achieved massive rewards for their efforts, whether in dot-coms or investment banking or hedge funds. People are achieving great wealth more quickly and at greater magnitude than ever before. And many of those people are looking for the next challenge. Many of them are actually at this conference looking for the next challenge. What can they do once the challenge of earning money and the need to earn money is no longer particularly satisfying? How can they get involved in the nonprofit sector? We see it at another level of MBA students graduating, and many choosing to come to nonprofit consulting firms like ours or others, taking lesser compensation, but being able to work on social issues. And we see it in the traditional business context as businesses want to tout their volunteering and social investment and contributions as a way of attracting talent. The nonprofit sector so far has not been very good at utilizing this talent. I think the common response has been, give us your money and go enjoy the south of France. But it's a tremendous amount of talent, and this flood of talent is continuing. And these are people who are very comfortable using the for-profit tools to achieve social ends. Lastly, I wanted to touch on this idea of what makes effective donors. And this was a very interesting engagement that we did for the Gates Foundation. They asked us to interview a couple dozen people who give away at least $1 million a year and are perceived as highly effective donors by their peers or other experts in philanthropy. And we wanted to know what made them that way. And frankly, these were a very diverse group. They made their money in different ways. They lived in different regions of the country, men and women, young and older. And we didn't expect to find anything much in common. We actually did find a common thread that ran through all the interviews. We found that all of these donors started out in philanthropy very skeptical that philanthropy would actually make a real difference in the world. They gave out of a sense of obligation. People approached them. They were visible. They participated on boards. But they didn't really think that philanthropy was going to make much of a difference. And every one of them went through what we began to call a first-hand stretch experience. They, at some point, and it could be years later, came across an issue of great personal significance to them. It could be a son with a brain disease. It could be a beautiful historic theater that was going to be torn down. It could be a nature preserve that someone had hiked on as a child that was going to be developed. In every case, it was an issue that really mattered, and there was a sense of urgency. And they decided to take action. And they shifted away from thinking about giving away money to thinking about how do I solve a problem. And that was a very fundamental shift. And they began to roll up their sleeves and get involved. Many of these people ended up spending half or all of their time on their philanthropic projects. Many of them created new organizations, actively brought in others as collaborators, became literally world authorities on the issue that they were trying to solve, and completely focused on it. And they began to see some impact from their efforts. Sometimes the money, more often their own contribution as individuals, of their talents and time and energy. But actually seeing change happen. They didn't always solve the problem, but they saw that their efforts were making progress. And it changed how they thought about philanthropy in all that they do. And it was interesting to us because it helped explain the kind of randomness we saw about who becomes an effective donor and who doesn't. We talk about a learning curve, but in philanthropy, people can stay at the same place on the learning curve their whole life. And yet, every now and then, you run into people who really are making a difference in the world. And it was this first-hand stretch experience that really changed people's approach. A friend of mine is actually working on creating a travel agency that will do a variation of adventure travel for very wealthy families that is basically philanthropy travel, that will expose people to issues and opportunities, and certainly people like the social entrepreneurs we've met here, around the world, in an effort to try and create this first-hand stretch experience for them, or at least the direct observation of the need and the opportunity. So when you put it together, we think that people in the nonprofit sector are increasingly using for-profit tools. Serious businesses in the for-profit sector are increasingly trying to solve social issues. People are accepting the idea of a financial and social return together. And there is this tremendous upwelling of talent that wants to use what they've learned and the money they've made to be able to achieve social change. And so I think it's very hard for us to let go of the idea of two separate sectors, just as it's very hard for me to read a long document on the computer screen. But those of you below a certain age have no problem doing it, I'm told. It's a generational shift. And yet I think that from a number of different directions, and more importantly, if we are going to address the problems that we have let slide too long, we need to merge these two sectors, and that social entrepreneurship really is the first step toward doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Any specific questions on that presentation? At the back, sir.
I'm not sure where to start. Thank you for the challenge.
You can introduce yourself, John.
Oh, sorry, John Pepin. I've worked both in charities and the corporate sector, and so I'm going to come at it from several perspectives. I'm going to take you up on your challenge around the corporate sector being able to do something in a year. And if you look at the Framework Convention Alliance, which is brought about with 300 NGOs, tobacco control and legislation adopted by over 150 countries in a very short period of time with no resources, and despite what the, I'm sounding very radical, but I'm not that radical. So there's an example on the other side. Throughout this conversation, there's been basic assumptions that I think as part of the research and part of the agenda should be questioned. And I see that living in two societies, coming from Canada but also living here for several years, and having an American partner, an American company, that there's a need, I think, in this discussion to question basic assumptions. The first speaker assumed that independent foundations supported by individuals is a good thing, and that a monopoly, a government monopoly, is potentially not a good thing. There's issues around competition is good. There's issues around the two sectors actually joining together. I think they can join together, and they have been partnering for a long time. But when you look at private-public partnerships, the ends are quite different. And sometimes the outcomes can be not always good for the consumer. And so I think there's just some serious questions. I think the points that you're making about using young talent, of people being more effective, and the system not always working well are really valuable points. And I'm glad that people are being challenged by those points.
Thank you, and I certainly wouldn't defend quite as an extreme position as I took. So I don't disagree that there have been remarkable achievements in the nonprofit sector as well. And I don't mean to suggest that the corporate world is effective and the nonprofit world is not. And they each do bring very different skills and talents. And I do believe that it is the partnership of them that really is the most effective answer in many cases.
Another question?
Graham Lean from Daniel Partners. I'd just like to corroborate something that Mark Kramer said. We've done quite a lot of work within the creative industries, particularly with SMEs, and as part of this database of maybe about 1,000 small companies, the surprising find was that only 5% of these companies actually were working for economic gain, economic benefit. fully 60-odd% were working because they wanted to do great creative work, and another 30 or so % wanted to do something that was good for society. So as an example, even this sector, which is actually growing very fast, you've got probably a majority of companies that actually are not doing it for profit, and that's actually one of the reasons it's difficult to find investment for them.
Terrific.
One more, this lady over here on the right.
I have a mic up here.
Okay, sorry, carry on.
Okay, thank you. I just was curious, as I've heard this notion before about this idea that for-profit companies are going to find their competitive edge through, being more socially beneficial. I just wondered if you could reflect on that a little bit in light of the kind of changes over the years that I think have made them more responsive to market pressures that force them to look at short-term profits instead of long-term profits, which sort of is counterintuitive to the idea that they're looking at social benefit. And I think that plays itself out on a kind of a micro level when you're just trying to engage with a corporation to do something good, or give more than token amounts to doing good, or on the level of sort of taking greater risk.
Yeah, I think that that's right. The tension between long-term issues and benefits and short-term costs is really the barrier in many cases to businesses being more responsive on social issues. I think that that is changing as they do find short-term opportunities. Certainly, if it were not for the activist movements that raised many issues to the attention of the public and the media, companies would not have had the awakening that many of them have had. Nike, for example, was a poster child of bad labor practices in the supply chain in Indonesia, and has since become a poster child for corporate responsibility, and has really changed how employment practices are. It's funny, we work with companies from around the world, and we see them converging on a global standard that is being the expected behavior. And we actually think it's quite positive. I think the UK companies are in the lead. I think US is behind. And I think Asia is further behind. But we hear executives from these companies all talking about trying to figure out this corporate responsibility thing and how they do it. I think that the combination of tremendous liabilities, like the asbestos litigation or smoking litigation, increased government regulation, disclosure of risks that's required in the UK, for example, and changing consumer tastes. I, a few months ago, turned in my BMW for a Prius. Are together changing the environment in which businesses think about these issues.
Just Helmut, did you want to?
No, just very quickly, I think if you're right about a social value proposition, then the business schools, certainly in the United States, are missing the boat big time, because they're not preaching this, and 99% of economics is doing something that is not along the lines that you're suggesting.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we do see, at Harvard Business School, social entrepreneurship is the largest student club by a significant margin. Stanford has built social entrepreneurship and philanthropy into their program to a degree. But I think that the students are ahead of the schools in this regard, in their thinking.
One quick last question on this phase, and then
hello, my name is Caroline Mason, and I work for an organisation called Investing for Good. And we spend our entire time talking to asset managers and wealth managers and private banks to try and integrate social investments into either advisory or discretionary portfolios. And I agree that there's a huge interest and understanding amongst individuals, wealthy individuals, and that very clear understanding of taking a lower return for a social gain. And on the other side, you do have incredibly innovative and inspiring organisations that need the capital. But unfortunately, in the middle, you have a massive capital markets mechanism and machinery that does not function in a way that bridges those two. And I just wondered, and similarly with foundations who have 95% of their investments often in, as recently with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where their investments are completely at odds with their mission. And again, that's part of the capital markets mechanism and machinery. So I wondered what hope you hold out for a break in that machinery and even possibly a reversal of that machinery to try and tackle these problems?
Well, we too have met with the investment advisor community and agree with you that they find that the idea of a social return factoring in to be nonsensical. This, I think, is part of the generational shift. I think they need to die off, so that'll happen. But you know, I also think that those of us doing social investing have not been perhaps as responsible as we could be. You know, foundations have been making these mission investments for 40 years. Until we did this study, nobody had looked at the default rate of loans. Boards assumed that the default rates were really high. They're not. And, you know, it's just, again, when we researched foundations, a majority of them did not keep adequate records so that we could calculate the internal rate of return of their investment. Some, frankly, didn't know whether they'd been paid back or not. You know, it's a different process than either grant making or traditional investing, and it's been so small that they haven't set up a separate set of processes in most cases that really take it seriously. I also think we use the term investment, as my friend Lester, I think, will, to talk about philanthropic contributions that achieve merely a social impact. And I think that the terminology issue is a problem as well. So I think we could be a bit tougher on ourselves about reporting what's happening, and that would help with the investment community. But they will die off. Thank you.
Thank you. If we can now move to our third and final speaker, Lester Salomon.
This thing working. Well, let me thank Mark in particular for making what I have to say relevant. I was worried that when I decided what to talk about, it would be so far from the topic of this session that I would be booed off the stage, so I thank you. As you'll hear, I'm going to look at the same reality and come to a somewhat different conclusion. The reality I want to look at is the reality of the trends in the broader social entrepreneurship community. And my conclusion is that we certainly are moving towards a new concept of social problem solving, but it's a concept that emphasizes the integration and cooperation among the sectors as opposed to the outright merger of them. And so I have in mind a kind of new concept of a three-sector society that emphasizes cooperation, and really believe that that's what we should be using the term civil society to refer to, a society that has three sectors but that have a certain degree of distinctness and centers of gravity to them, but that have learned to cooperate in solving social problems. But what I really want to do is focus on the social sector, and I really want to make 3 points in the time that I have, which we're slowly running out of. First of all, a point that I think is now fairly obvious, but I think needs really to be pinned down and secured, and that is that entrepreneurship is by no means a new phenomenon in the social sector. To see this, though, we have to broaden the lens a bit and move into what I think is really the title of this conference, which is not social enterprise, but social entrepreneurship. And I think when you broaden the term, and I think the concept of social entrepreneurship to me is broader than social enterprise, I think that what we'll discover is an enormous amount of entrepreneurship at work, certainly over the last 20 to 30 years. The second point I want to emphasize, and I'll come to this towards the end, is something that has been a kind of implicit motive in this conference, but has not really been, I think, sufficiently explicitly addressed. And that is the idea that social entrepreneurship, while it creates enormous opportunities, also poses some pretty significant risks. And I think some of the comments today were suggestions about those risks. And while we ought to be about celebrating social entrepreneurship and social enterprise as a component of it, I think we also have an obligation to face up to some of these risks and think about how to deal with them. And then the third point I want to make is that there are some steps that we can begin to think about that address these risks and, in a way, preserve the values of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise without falling headlong into a set of risks that we may regret if we don't confront them. The focus of my remarks today is going to be on the U.S., and I apologize for that. The data that I've pulled together recently that is reported in a book called The Resilient Sector, which is the topic of what I want to talk about, does focus on the U.S., but I think any of you who have followed my work realize that I'm well aware that, that there's much more going on in the world, that we're in the midst, as I've put it in some of my writings, of a global associational revolution, a kind of massive upsurge of organized private, philanthropic, and voluntary activity all over the world. We've done work in now some 40 countries around the world trying to scope out the extent of this phenomenon of the social entrepreneurial or the social sector of the societies of different parts of the world. And what we've discovered is that this is an enormous presence that outdistances many major industries. This chart shows the workforce of the civil society sector in some 40 countries around the world, and it shows that that workforce exceeds the workforce in the utilities industries in those countries, and the transportation industry in those countries, and the construction industry in those countries. It engages as both paid employees and volunteers, half as many people as work in all of manufacturing in those countries. So we're talking about an enormous presence that exists all over the world and is by no means confined to Anglo-Saxon countries or any particular region of the world. And while I'm going to talk about the U.S., and everybody seems to believe that the U.S. has the largest nonprofit sector and the most philanthropy, and certainly this is the perspective that is sold to you by most speakers from America, the truth is that we're now able to demonstrate that the U.S. doesn't have the largest nonprofit sector, that there are many countries in the world. Well, first let me, this chart shows the overall scale of the third sector if it were conceived of as an economy, and it demonstrates that the $1.9 trillion US dollars of expenditures of the civil society sector, if it were a country, would make it the sixth largest or fifth largest economy in the world. So we're talking about a major economic presence, and I think the more we come to recognize that, the more we can both conceive of its potentials and also in certain ways hold it to higher standards. But the U.S. is not by any means the largest of these economies, this civil society sector. Here is the U.S. in this chart. This is the share of the workforce of the civil society sector that is represented by different countries. And as you can see, there are a number of countries in the world, the Netherlands, Canada, Belgium, and Ireland, that have nonprofit sectors, civil society sectors that exceed the American one. What I want to do, though, is to take a look at the last 20 or 25 years of development of the American nonprofit sector, because I think it has in it an important story that is, I think, consistent with what Mark was saying about the transformation that has been underway in this sector, considered broadly. The story that I think it has, it presents to us is a kind of refutation of what has been the received wisdom, certainly in the business school view of the nonprofit sector and maybe broadly in the economics view. And that view has essentially painted the third sector as a kind of backwash, a backwater, lacking in innovation, lacking in entrepreneurship, unable to really make efficient use of resources as compared to the for-profit sector. And I think it's fair to say that some of the enthusiasm for social enterprise springs from that conception that somehow we must bring the world of business to the world of the nonprofit sector to make it efficient. This is a quotation from Rosabeth Moss Cantor, a leading figure at the Harvard Business School, writing in the Harvard Business Review in the 1980s. Comparing nonprofit organizations to for-profit organizations and essentially arguing that profit-making organizations are more flexible in the deployment and redeployment of resources and as a consequence are much more efficient. My argument is very different. When I looked at the last 20 or so years of history of American nonprofits, what I found is a reality that really challenged that notion very fundamentally. I found a resilient sector, an entrepreneurial sector, a sector that had reinvented itself and was constantly reinventing itself, that was squeezing extraordinary results out of limited resources, and doing so in the face of a number of very serious challenges. And so what I want to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is three things, really. One, outline the challenges that American nonprofits have faced during this period, and they have been quite significant. Talk a bit about how the sector has responded to those challenges, and I find the response extraordinary and a sign of real entrepreneurial talent. Then talk about some of the risks that the responses have brought with them. The responses have been very substantial and have moved the sector in very important directions, but they have posed risks that I think it's important to recognize. And then I want to close by suggesting some of the things that need to change in order to allow this very positive set of responses, both in our country and elsewhere in the world, to avoid or minimize the risks while taking advantage of the opportunities. So let me begin by talking about at least some of the major challenges that have confronted American nonprofits, and I think nonprofits elsewhere in the world. The first of these is a fiscal challenge, perhaps the perennial challenge of nonprofit organizations all over the world. We've done a variety of bodies of research, all of which come back with a similar message that nonprofit organizations, I think perennially maybe, but certainly in our country up through the mid-2000s, were experiencing what they reported as quite substantial fiscal stress. This is the share of organizations that responded to a survey that we did under a program or project that we call the Listening Post Project. We've essentially built a information platform on the third sector throughout the United States, and we correspond to these organizations on a regular basis. And when we surveyed them in the in 2003, over half of them were reporting severe or very severe fiscal stress. Another 35% were reporting moderate fiscal stress, and only a very small handful, about 14% of the organizations, were telling us that they did not feel fiscal stress. And so we looked a little more closely at what the causes of that might be, and there are a variety of causes in the American setting, and they, I think, resonate very well with causes elsewhere in the world. We've been through a 20-year period or so of very significant governmental retrenchment that began during the Reagan era, from the period in the early 1980s through the mid-1990s. About 25% of the value of government support to nonprofit organizations was sliced out of the budgets of nonprofit organizations in the United States, creating a kind of psychology of restriction that has eased a little bit in fiscal terms, but has not disappeared from the mental screen of nonprofits. And then in the turn of the century, we had another fiscal scare, which shows up in the figures that I showed you. And so there has been a kind of perennial tightening of government support, at least up through the mid-90s and now returning. But that's not the only source of fiscal pressure on organizations. There has also been a very dramatic change in the form of public sector support that, again, I think resonates around the world. A shift essentially from producer-side subsidies going to organizations to consumer-side subsidies driven by ideological notions about choice for consumers. But translated into the space that nonprofits occupy, it meant a shift in the whole nature of their operations from essentially receiving producer-side subsidies directly from the public sector towards having to move into the market to compete with other potential providers of services for the revenue, the public sector revenue that was available to them. And so they're forcing nonprofits into a kind of market setting. In the early in the mid to late 1970s, probably 70 or 80% of public sector support to nonprofits took the form of grants or contracts, and these went to producers. By the late 1990s, early 2000s, 70 to 80% of that funding was coming in the form of various voucher payments, typically through our Medicare and Medicaid health programs that essentially put money into the hands of consumers and force the producer into a market relationship. Whatever your feelings about that in substantive policy terms, it made a very significant difference in the operating style of nonprofits and created a need for really a massive shift in how they do business. And then a third element that has affected the nonprofit sector has been the relatively tepid growth of private giving. This may surprise you a bit because you have doubtless heard about the constantly surging growth of giving in the United States. Giving, to say the least, is overrated as a source of income of nonprofits, whatever it is in the way of a source of ideas. The fact is that while giving has grown, it's not grown in relation to any of the other indicators that it's relevant to compare it to. One of those indicators is personal income, and as a share of personal income, private giving from all sources, corporate giving, foundation giving, individual giving, has been in a steady decline, at least was up through the late 90s when the dot-com boom was underway. It grew a bit in the late 90s, but then declined. But if you look back to the 70s, it was about 1.86% of personal income. In the 80s, it had gone down to 1.78% of personal income. By the early 90s, it had gone down to 1.64% of personal income. And translated into the income stream for nonprofits, there has been a steady erosion of the share that giving represents of the income of American nonprofits. And this has occurred pretty broadly across a number of fields. If you look in this chart at the share of the total income that comes from giving from all sources, it was 27% in 1977. It was down to 20% in 1997. This includes religion. If you take religion out, because we're mainly focused on human welfare activities, the share that giving represented went from about 18% of the total down to 12%, which means, in another way of looking at it, that giving has simply not been a major source of the growth of the sector. This is the share of the revenue growth between 77 and 97. Giving accounted for only 8% of that growth once you take religion out of the picture. And so giving simply has not provided the engine to fuel the growth of the nonprofit sector to respond to the problems that we have faced as a society. And this has intensified the pressure on nonprofit organizations and made it very difficult for them to see in giving a solution to the government retrenchment that was underway. The second challenge that the organizations have faced has been a competitive challenge. Nonprofits are increasingly in our country in a very fierce competitive battle with for-profit competitors that have moved into traditional fields of nonprofit activity. Perhaps this is all for the good. Competition is good for the soul and good for efficiency, but it has certainly put enormous pressures on nonprofit organizations. The evidence of this is quite striking across a broad array of fields. Again, these data show the share that the nonprofits represent of different fields of activity in the United States, showing the difference between 1982 and 1997. And this reports the percent share change in the relative nonprofit share. And so you can see in a number of fields from daycare, home health, kidney dialysis, rehabilitation hospitals, a steady penetration of for-profits into traditional nonprofit fields. Why is this happening? I think that an important part of the explanation has to do with the availability of capital. Nonprofits have a inherent inability to generate capital in the places where capital is easiest to generate, which is the equity markets, where you can get free capital. You can get capital provided by investors who are looking for a return on their investment through the profits that corporations are able to generate. Nonprofits are forbidden from providing an equity return, a return on equity. They're prohibited from distributing profits. And so they have, I think, particular difficulties generating investment capital. And here I mean capital that is used for long-term growth. And what this translates into is particular difficulty in times when there is a surge of demand for services. And we've gone through a number of periods where there have been surges of demand produced partly by demographic changes, but really even more directly produced by government policy shifts that make available support for particular lines of service that formerly were not available for public sector support. One of the most dramatic of these was in the home health field, which, as you see, began as a nonprofit innovative field and quickly was transformed into a dominant for-profit field. The trigger for this was the opening of our Medicare support system, the main health support system for the elderly, its willingness beginning in 1980 to finance home health care, to get people out of hospitals where the care was more expensive and into home health care facilities. This created an enormous surge of demand. And when you have an enormous surge of demand, you need quickly to build the facilities to meet that demand. Nonprofits simply were disadvantaged in being able to access the investment capital needed to respond to that surge in demand, and therefore for-profits moved into that industry. And while this, again, is positive, there are fields such as psychiatric hospitals where the demand is produced, the for-profits move in, Medicare then realizes that its reimbursement rates are too generous. It cuts back on the reimbursement rates, the for-profits exit the field, and people are left without services. The work that we've done through our Listening Post project has demonstrated a very significant growth in the need for capital on the part of nonprofits. We used to think of nonprofits as essentially labor-intensive institutions. They are increasingly capital-intensive institutions, and therefore their need for capital has grown quite considerably. But what they tell us is that their access to capital is extremely limited. And so 90% have needs for capital in the technology area. Only 35, 40% are telling us that they are able to meet those needs. And when we look at the sources of capital that nonprofits are able to access, it turns out that their access to the major sources of capital in the economy, which take the form of pension funds and insurance companies, is extremely limited. This chart shows the share of organizations that tell us that they are fairly or, fairly or extremely difficult to access the sources of capital. So 99% are either unaware of or find it very difficult to access pension funds, and 94% insurance companies. The ones that they are easiest to access are foundations and individual donors, but this takes time. It takes a particular kind of nonprofit to be able to access. So we are seeing an enormous challenge arising from the competition that nonprofits are facing. They're under enormous pressure as a consequence. The third challenge that I want to just touch on briefly is what I refer to as the legitimacy challenge. Nonprofits in the United States, I think perhaps in other countries as well, are increasingly under considerable suspicion. At least they are the objects of very real lack of confidence. And this seems not to be getting better in the United States. In the mid-90s, only about a third of the population in population polls were telling us that they had a lot or quite a lot, a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in nonprofit human service agencies. And after the 9/11 episode, far from increasing, the confidence level in nonprofit organizations actually deteriorated further, so that only 18% reported that they were they had a lot of confidence in the nonprofit sector. And so this is a very quick thumbnail sketch of a sector that is in certain ways beleaguered, under pressure, facing fiscal stress, facing increased competition, and having doubts about the public confidence in it. This is not, in some respects, a happy story. How did the nonprofit sector respond? How has it coped with this set of pressures that it's under? My view of the response is that it's been actually pretty positive. In fact, incredibly positive. It's taken a number of different forms. First and most obvious has been the growth that the sector has achieved in the face of these pressures. Nonprofits in America have grown at really quite an extraordinary rate. Their rate of growth over this 20-year period was about 50% faster than the overall economy. We had an economy that grew in real terms by 81%. The nonprofit sector grew in terms of its expenditures and revenues by 144%. And so it was doing pretty well in terms of coping with the stress under which it was operating. And the growth was pretty widespread. Virtually every sector, every component of the American nonprofit sector grew at a rate that was faster than the growth rate of the overall economy. So this is a pretty good record. We have a humorist in the United States called Garrison Keillor, you may have heard of. He has this program called Lake Wobegon, and he always jokes that Lake Wobegon is the place where all the women are beautiful and all the children are above average. And we have a Lake Wobegon sector here. It grows at an above average rate for all its components. This has continued into the more recent time. We have data up through 2003, and it shows the same pattern, about 50% faster growth rate of nonprofit revenue compared to the for-profit sector. And when we went out and surveyed these organizations that were reporting great risk, great financial distress, we found them reporting that at the end of the day, they had found ways to be successful financially. 17% claimed they were very successful, and another 60% that they were somewhat successful. So 3/4 in the face of fiscal distress report that they're doing pretty well. And lest you think that this isn't a purely American phenomenon, this is actually very common from the data that we are now generating around the world. This is a sector of robust growth, whose growth is exceeding the growth rate of the overall economies. These are data from work that I'll mention in a bit. This shows the overall percentage change in GDP. These are the nonprofit numbers. So the average of these 4 countries, 6.4% growth per year by nonprofits, 3.3% by the economy as a whole. And you can see this in the USA, in Belgium, in Japan, and Canada. The sector grew only at the rate of growth of the overall economy. So this raises the question, how is this happening? What is it that's allowing the nonprofit sector to do so well in the face of these changes? And this brings me then to the second point about the response. And the key to the response has been the commercialization of the sector, or for those who find that word offensive or think that I'm being negative, we could substitute the word entrepreneurialism for that word if you don't like it. But the fundamental reality is that nonprofits during this period have made a very massive leap into the world of entrepreneurial activity, building, I think, on traditions that have been in the sector. And this has taken a variety of forms. One of them is the successful reaching out and marketing to paying customers. Nonprofits have responded to the pressures in a classic entrepreneurial way. Instead of pulling back and sheltering in a corner, they have taken the position that the best defense is a good offense. And so when we go out and ask them how have they coped with the fiscal pressure that they were facing, most of them are doing outreach and positive things. They're not pulling back, they're not cutting programs, they're extensively reaching out to new patrons, they're adding new programs, they're expanding their geographic reach. These are the major types of action that they're taking. To be sure, some are reducing their activity, but the overwhelming story is one of aggressively attempting to reach out, to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, to be responsive. The most common technique in terms of funding that they've taken is, again, to reach out to commercial income, to increase their fee income that they charge to clients, to become more market-oriented. And the consequence of this is apparent when we look at the funding base of the sector, which has moved increasingly in the direction of commercial income. Commercial income is unquestionably the largest source of revenue of American nonprofits, has been for some time. This is not new. It has long been the case in the hospital and education fields, but what's striking is the spread of fee income into other fields, most notably in the field of social services, where it went from 13% of the total to almost 30% of the total. And fee income clearly was the driver of growth. About half the income that fueled the growth of the sector during this period came from commercial fees and charges. And so this is not a new phenomenon, this turn to the market. It has been in place in certain subsectors. It is now spreading to other parts of the sector. In addition to successfully marketing to paying customers, the nonprofit sector also found ways to successfully pursue public funds. And we did experience growth in some of the public funding, and nonprofits managed to hold their own and go after that public funding. And so when we look at the sources of growth overall of nonprofit revenue during this dramatic growth period, fees and charges are 51%, but government support is 42%, almost as great. So this was a period of continued growth of public sector support. As I pointed out before, philanthropy is 7 to 8% of the growth that occurred. And that's not, of course, the only type of commercialization pressure or commercialization and response. There have been other activities as well. There's been a revolution in charitable fundraising. Were it not for that, I suspect that giving would have declined even further as a share of the total. It took many different forms, new instruments of charitable fundraising, donor-advised funds, charitable remainder funds, a real revolution in the financial side of fundraising. And other kinds of changes. The venture activity that nonprofits have increasingly gone into, supplementing their appeal for fees and charges with the creation of a variety of ventures that have extended the commercial involvement of the nonprofit sector. And then more broadly, the adoption of the market culture. And this was not, of course, a one-way street, because for everything that the nonprofit took in, it also gave back, and so we see this penetration going both ways. The business sector absorbing concepts of nonprofit management, stressing the need for mission statements, which became a new phase and new craze in the for-profit world. And so one answer to the question of how did nonprofits cope with the challenges of the past 20 or 25 years clearly is massive growth of entrepreneurial activity and massive growth, more specifically, of commercial sources of income and commercial modes of operation. A second type of change that occurred, also very significant, was the professionalization of this field. And you have gone through it as much as we have, growth of infrastructure, growth of the fundraising profession, management support organizations springing up all over the place, degree and certificate programs at universities. So there has been significant change in the whole structure and character of the third sector that has gone on during this period. Let me turn now to the risks that this raises. I can't see the clock, so how are we doing? Okay, well, let me quickly wrap up. I think it's important for all of us to take account of the fact that there are not only opportunities arising from this entrepreneurial surge in the sector, but also very significant risks. And they take a number of different forms. I think there is within our third sector a kind of growing identity crisis, a questioning of what it is that nonprofits are supposed to be doing and of what it is that's supposed to give them distinctness. This may be a positive sign if we take Mark's suggestion that maybe we ought to obliterate these differences, but it does create considerable uncertainty and ambiguity within the organizations that I think need some kind of resolution. Beyond that, I think the demands on nonprofit managers have grown enormously. These are some of the most difficult jobs, I think, in our society because of the number of stakeholders and the diversity of demands on these people. I think that there is a significant potential threat to the fundamental missions that these organizations are pursuing. They're being torn in multiple directions, having to make very tough decisions about where to put the next incremental dollar of time and resources. Do they go after paying customers in the suburbs, or do they remain devoted to the real serious problems in central cities? Under these pressures, the pain of making those decisions, I think, becomes increasingly intense. I think the threshold of sustainability in the sector has gone up. This disadvantages small agencies. It's very difficult to interact with Medicaid reimbursement procedures, a very complex business. And so nonprofits have had to ratchet up their capabilities in order to play in this kind of new ballgame. And then finally, I think continuously there is a growing threat from the public side. The public simply does not understand this merger of the sectors, and maybe the new generation will come to understand it better, but there is a great confusion in the public mind about how nonprofits are behaving and what the differences are and what the justification is for their tax advantages. Let me turn then to what needs to be done about all of this. And I want to just outline three suggestions, if I can. Are we out of time already?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Make the quick suggestions.
The first of them is a need to fundamentally refocus on values and mission. I think there has been some discussion of that in this conference, but to my taste, probably a little too little. And I think the sector as a whole, including the social enterprise sector, needs to think very seriously about the values and mission that it needs to pursue and keep that forefront. Secondly, I think there needs to be improved public understanding and trust in the sector, which is going to require several different kinds of action, improved accountability. I think there is work going on that, but also improved data and information. And we have been engaged in trying to extend the information resources on this sector, most notably through a major effort to implement a new United Nations handbook on nonprofit institutions that will give us a very significant body of new data. And then finally, I think there needs to be, though I'm going to have to, probably won't be able to run through that, a very significant surge of capital into the sector, which I think will require a new form of behavior on the part of foundations, a shift in foundations from a focus on grants as the provider, as the mechanism for providing resources, to a different concept of foundations, thinking of foundations as philanthropic banks with an array of financial vehicles available, adding to grants, loans and loan guarantees and various kinds of insurance schemes. So at the end of the day, central point is that I would urge that we move away from dividing the third sector between the social enterprise world and the world of social action more generally. I think entrepreneurialism is very much alive in the nonprofit sector at large, and it seems to me that more intense cooperation between these different components of the sector is what's needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so time is now a little short, but let's take, if we can, at least one round of questions. Hands up. We'll take 3 if we can, 2 over here and 1 over there.
My name is Peter Kenyon from Peace Path Consulting. Lester, you sort of explained how this great response from the non-profit sector, which seems to me largely in their ability to raise money and survive, whereas Mark gave some data that actually the evidence suggests that they haven't actually made a great difference in the last 20, 30 years in the US. So do you have any evidence of success as defined by their increasing ability to have some impact and make a difference?
Okay, let's hold that and take 2 more, and then we'll come back to the question of impact. Thank you. Over here.
My name's Cordelia. I have a social enterprise in Ghana, but my background is in development in Africa. And I realize that you're talking about the US and the UK, but the NGO sector seems to be talked about as though it's one. But when you work in it, the donors in the NGO sector all have their own agendas, whether they're bilateral, multilateral, or religious. And so it's kind of, I don't see how you can project that it can merge itself in with another sector of philanthropy when itself is so divided, in fact, mutually exclusive on many of their own issues.
Thank you. One more, gentleman there.
Mark, I wonder if you could tell us, sorry, Andy Cooper from Ashoka, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the fund and thoughts on how UBS and you are working with your extensive knowledge in the respective sectors on both looking credible and on how you came to the kinds of numbers you were describing, whether to what extent those are somewhat speculative or to what extent you're fairly firm and what evidence allows you to be fairly firm on those numbers. Thanks.
Okay, should we begin with that, Mark, then? Thank you.
Sure. No, we've been working on this for about a year at this point, and it's something that we hope we will be able to offer this summer and close this fall. We have had teams in Africa, both identifying people on the ground there who can be part of the management team and identifying potential deals. And we think that we have found enough deals that have reasonably attractive rates of return. You know, it's very surprising when you look at the data, and I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me, but there is quite a bit of private pay healthcare in Africa among even the second and third quintiles of the pyramid. Not the very bottom, but there are still, you know, people making a couple dollars a day. So we've done a fair amount of due diligence at this point. We've assembled a team with a background in emerging market investment, and we do think that we are going to be able to pull it off. We'll see next year. They have been helping us pull this together, and they will raise the funding from their network of high net worth investors. We're also talking with a very large foundation about being the lead investor, and we can't name them yet, but we're hopeful that they will come in and actually take a layer of risk that will reduce the risk for other investors.
Thank you. Can we then address the issue about the crucial issue of the relationship between growth and growth of impact, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I think just stand up. I'm not sure that either of us can stand here and say that things have gotten completely solved or that there's been no progress. Either of those positions, I think, is untenable. I think the real answer is compared to what? You know, compared to what have things gotten better or worse? And I could cite as numerous a list of things that have gotten better as Mark can cite have gotten worse. And at the end of the day, I think we'll conclude that it's a draw. And I think but there clearly have been areas where a combination of public sector and private sector involvement have significantly improved the quality of life for people. And I would be absurd to say that our society is without problems. That's absolutely not true. But just to take one, the aging poor as a problem in our society, while it hasn't disappeared, is radically different than it was 30, 40 years ago. Now, what is the component parts of our Social Security system and our old age assistance system and the nonprofit home care and home health network? very difficult to sort out. But I would assert that there are significant areas where things have gotten better as a consequence of the involvement of the nonprofit sector. I probably would cite the environmental area where, to be sure, there are enormous problems, but where the active nonprofit organizations, both domestically and globally, have just put a whole new concept on the agenda of people. Civil rights would be another area where nonprofits were fundamental in raising issues and I think making enormous progress in solving them. The gender issue. So I could go on and cite numerous issues. Now, does that mean it's sufficient, it's adequate? No. But I think it's unfair to not see the progress even while criticizing the reality that there's still problems. And on the question of the diversity of the sector, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that the sector is all of a single part. There is enormous diversity. But I think there's a lot to be gained by this sector's learning to work together, the different components of this sector. That means the traditional nonprofit organizations as well as the new social enterprises as well as the funders. I think the dilemma in the past has been that we have not really had available to us a concept of a third sector as a reasonably distinct set of institutions. We've had no data about them. We've never been able to see the sector as a whole, and the consequence of that has been that the sector has been unable to act as an entity. And I think that's unfortunate. And the more the sector can attract the components of the business sector that have a similar outlook, and that I think is the key. The outlook, the values, the purposes have to be accepted on both sides. But the more the sector can bring in business into that discussion, the stronger things will be.
I'm afraid two final questions, one at the back and one at the back. We'll have one final question.
Can I ask?
Your coffee's
how can the government sector finance non-profit in a way without encroaching on the agenda of the non-profit? And on the reverse side, how can the non-profit pursue the government aggressively to be able to get their money and with effectiveness? What would you advise on that? My name is Greensak Jurvasak. I'm a member of parliament from Thailand.
Perhaps could each just reflect finally on the relationship between government and non-profit, starting with Mark? Or starting with Helmut?
Well, for sure the relationship is not perfect. But I think there are places where it's working not badly. And that may be the best that can be said about it. I think that economic theory tells us that some of the fears we have about the government's ability to control the nonprofit sector are overstated. This is a body of theory called principal agent theory. And in practice, it is very difficult for government to hold nonprofits accountable for everything they do. And that may be bad as well as good, but in practice, nonprofits have learned that they get a fair amount of autonomy even when they are significantly funded by public sector. Western Europe is a region in which the government funding of nonprofit organizations has been enormous. It has not been totally without controls, but it's not the kind of intrusive controls that I think many people in the developing world experience. Where nonprofits have been given legal rights to assistance. This is the pattern in Germany, it's the pattern in the Netherlands, where there are legal requirements that government finance nonprofits as the vehicle for delivering services. So the more that becomes the expectation, and I think increasingly it is the expectation, governments are learning they simply can't do all that they're being asked to do. And so I think there's a very striking worldwide trend of increased partnering with nonprofit organizations to pursue social purposes. So I think there are models of contracting arrangements, models of voucher arrangements, and models of grant arrangements that hold promise.
Okay, we are now fully out of time. So thank you again to the panel, and thank you to you for your questions.